You're listening to episode 125, Reclaiming Your Story on Your Path to Healing with Laura Parrott-Perry. Welcome to the Grass Gets Greener podcast, the show for survivors by survivors. I'm your host, Melissa Wilson, a bullying survivor and anti-bullying advocate. And each week you'll hear from a survivor who has overcome a traumatic experience to go on to not only survive, but thrive, so that you can too, starting now. Hey everyone, thanks so much for tuning into this episode. Today we're going to be joined by Laura Parrott-Perry from Say It Survivor. First, I want to mention that this episode is sponsored by Navni. Navni is the top-ranked anonymous writing website in the world. Navni provides free wellness resources and low-cost online therapy services to help people cope with various levels of emotional distress. Write anonymously, feel better at novni.com. And I hope you had a chance to check out the last episode with one of the co-founders of Navni, Jack Roscoe, where he explained the platform and hopefully, answer any questions you might have had about it. And I hope you've had a chance to check out Navni and that it's something that can be helpful to you. So back to today's episode, which I'm excited to bring to you. Laura is doing some great work, and for sexual abuse survivors in particular. Laura is a survivor of sexual abuse and bullying herself, and she's going to share her story with us today. In particular, you're going to hear about how Laura was sexually abused by her paternal grandfather from the age of 7 to 8, and what happened when she first told her parents about it, and the messages that her abuse sent her and how that affected her afterwards. And she's going to talk about how she was affected in school by bullying as well. And we're going to talk about how some of the things that we do to cope can be harmful in and of themselves. And Laura will share what led her to first share her story publicly, and how she got reconnected with her cousin who had been abused too, and what happened when they reported the abuse to the police. And she'll talk about how Say It Survivor came to be. And we're also going to talk a little bit about boundaries and self-care in this episode. So I hope you're looking forward to it. And without further ado, we'll go ahead and get into this one, and I'll go bring Laura on. Laura, welcome to the podcast, and thank you for joining me here today to share your story with us.
Well, thank you so much for asking me, Melissa. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm happy to have you here. So I first heard about you from Christine Sissy White, who was on almost a year ago, which is crazy, actually. But yeah, I'm glad she told me about you and the work you're doing, because you're someone I definitely want to have, share their story here on the podcast. And I know you have a book that just came out, so I guess the timing worked out well so that we can have you tell us about that also.
That worked very nicely.
Yeah. But what I like to do here, Laura, is start by having you share a little bit of your story and your background of what you experienced growing up, so that we have that context, and then we can go from there. Does that sound okay to you?
Sure, that sounds great.
Yeah, so just share with us what you'd like us to know about what you experienced and how old you were when it happened.
Sure. Well, I can't pinpoint exactly when it began, just because childhood memories can be a little tricky in terms of time.
Sure.
But at some point around the age of 7, my paternal grandfather, my dad's dad, began sexually abusing me. I remember the first time it crossed into overt abuse, but when I look back, there'd been kind of a long series of boundary violations over a good length of time leading up to that. It went on for about a year. Whenever we would see him, I didn't tell anyone. I knew it was wrong. I knew it was weird and uncomfortable and I guess a little scary. But it was the 1970s, and honestly, no one talked to kids that young about anything, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I didn't know what sex was. I certainly had never been talked to about abuse. And so I didn't really understand what was happening to me, and I didn't have the language to describe it, even if I had been inclined to, which I wasn't. And so then one weekend, when I was staying at his house. I guess I was probably about 8 at that time. He got me alone, and for whatever reason, and I don't know why that time I reacted differently, but that time I said no. And something about me saying no set him off.
Mm-hmm.
It changed the dynamic of it. And I don't know if it's that no one had said no to him before or what, but in any case, that was the first time that my abuse turned violent, or at least what I perceived to be violent.
Mm-hmm. So
He was
it made him more reactive, more.
yes,
Mm-hmm.
very angry. Well, I don't know. I don't know if it made him angry. It made him violent. That much
Mm-hmm.
I know. And so after it was over, he told me that if I told, people would be upset and they would be angry and they wouldn't believe me. And so, and I remember later that night standing in the kitchen and him coming up behind me and putting his hand on top of my head and squeezing it hard. And I think about that now and look back and go, it probably looked like a gesture of affection, and it wasn't,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And so I didn't tell anyone. Um,
Yeah, because you believe that what he said would be true, that no one would believe you.
hmm And I was just terrified. I didn't know what had happened. It really felt when it was happening like I was going to die, and that was my main concern was I just didn't want to die. Um, and so eventually I told my mother, and she was, we were coming back from Cape Cod. I was in the back seat of the car, and I told her, and I didn't really have the language to fully describe what had happened to me. I didn't understand what had happened to me, but I told her enough that she got the gist of it. And she was understandably devastated and outraged. Um, and then I remember sitting across from my dad in a family counseling session. My parents were getting divorced at the time, and understanding that he did not believe me, that he was really, really enraged, and not at what had happened to me, but because he didn't believe me.
Your dad, this is.
Correct. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And so, because of their reactions, even the understandable ones, my parents kind of unwittingly made my abuser a truth teller,
Mm-hmm.
because everything he said would happen happened
Mm-hmm.
in some form or fashion. People were upset, they were angry, and they didn't believe me.
Mm-hmm.
And so, because I was this little girl trying to make sense of a set of facts that had been dealt to me that I didn't understand them, I did what people have done since the beginning of time. I created a really simple story out of them, which was if he was right about those things, he's right about everything.
Mm-hmm. Because, yeah, that
Right.
sends a message to you, right? I mean, especially at that age, you're so impressionable, and, it sends you that message.
Right.
You
Yeah,
don't know any differently.
exactly. And so if he was right about those things, he was right about everything. And so every story that he had told me, either overtly or by what he did to me or the way he used my body, or all of those things that those messages that I got from him, I accepted as fact. I
Mm-hmm.
accepted what he taught me about myself and about where my value lay, and about what that my family wasn't safe and the world wasn't safe, and all of these things. I internalized them and I lived accordingly. And you
Mm-hmm.
move through the world very differently when you believe those things.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so my abuse was traumatic. Obviously, it was physically traumatic and emotionally traumatic and spiritually traumatic. But really, my real trauma, my lasting trauma, was born in the backseat of that car and on the couch in that therapist's office, where I came to believe everything he told me about myself.
Mm. And how old were you when the abuse ended?
8.
Okay.
hmm
Yeah. So tell me about how, all of the messages that you received and all the ways that, you were impacted at that age played out for you as you got older.
Right.
What did that look like for you in your life? How was that showing up?
Well, that whole time in my life was hugely traumatic because my parents were in the middle of a divorce. And after I disclosed, we basically never saw my dad's family again. So I lost half my family. Um, and we had a lot of financial insecurity after that. And so I was just drenched in fear all
Mm,
the time.
I can
Um,
imagine.
nothing felt guaranteed, you know. I had my first drink at 11. I had a suicide attempt at 12. Um, I was bullied relentlessly in middle school. I mean, in elementary school, I sort of had one tormentor who, I was her pet project. And then in middle school, I think bullies can sense the walking wounded.
Mm,
They can sense when it's like all predators to a certain extent, right? They're going to go after the gazelle that's limping,
yeah,
right?
they're looking for people to prey on,
For
the
sure.
easy targets.
100%. And I was limping. you know,
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
I was the walking wounded, and they could tell. And so it was. I spent an awful lot of time getting out of going to school. It's frankly a miracle I'm not still in seventh grade. Um, I feigned illness all the time. I just going to school was just like being sent into this arena with a lion, and every day fighting for your life. It just was terrible.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
How long did the bullying go on for?
all of middle school.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it got much better in high school for whatever reason. It still wasn't, I still had a couple of people who would bother me. But middle school, seventh and eighth grade were awful, just terrible.
Yeah,
Um,
that's when I was bullied as well, so I can understand what you went through.
it's
It's
just
it's terrible, and it's just a tough age to go through that.
exactly. It's a
Um,
tough age if there's nothing extra.
yeah, exactly. I mean, you
No,
had all the other stuff on top of it as well.
right. It's tough just at its baseline. There's so much
Mm-hmm.
change going on, and you're trying to figure out who you are, and yeah. So a lot of that. By 13 and 14, I was bulimic. And then I also later would struggle with anorexia. Um, lots of drinking in college, lots of really sort of toxic and harmful relationships, promiscuity. Um, I'm a recovering alcoholic now. I've been sober for 2.5 years, but alcohol was definitely an issue for me in college. Um, and I had I had terrible flashback dreams and triggers, and it played out a lot in my life.
Mm-hmm. PTSD symptoms, it sounds
Mhm.
like.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely. Yep.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, like I said, I can imagine. I mean, you went through so much and starting at such a young age. Of course, all that stuff is going to impact you and play out, and and into your adulthood and everything.
It
When
did, and there were some ways that it changed too. I mean, I had my son when I was 21, um, a senior in college, and for whatever reason, I think it was so important to me to give him the kind of childhood I hadn't had, that I sort of held it together for a long time. And that in some ways, not that my trauma didn't still affect me, but the ways that it affected me kind of changed. Like I became such a perfectionist, and control became a really big thing for me. And sort of the things that I was doing to kind of manage the ways that it used to play out in my life, which ended up being really harmful in their own right. Um, those kind of morphed during those years into, I find that survivors of any kind of trauma are really very clever and miraculous in many ways, because we find these ways to cope, and lots of times the ways that we cope become harmful in and of themselves, but they are ways of managing what feels unmanageable at the time, you
hmm
know.
yeah, I think there are ways to cope that help you, to get through that situation, but then it gets to a point where they're not serving you anymore, and
Right.
then you have to find new ways to kind of to heal and to be able to move past it so that it doesn't continue to to hold you back.
Right. Well, and what I find with a lot of the women I work with, I say that our coping mechanisms are frequently, I call them voluntary pains. Like when we're unwilling to work through that original pain, that trauma, when we're unwilling to do that work, we sign up for all these voluntary pains, which is a way to cope with and deal with the trauma that we're unwilling to examine and work through. And, it's like I work with so many young women who cut, that's not something I ever did, but I understand it.
Mm-hmm.
I understand, like, that's a pain you're in charge of. My drinking was a pain I was in charge of. My starving myself was a pain I was in charge of. It gave me some semblance of control, even
Right.
though really I, obviously wasn't in control, but it felt that way.
Mm-hmm.
It felt like a way to manage the pain that seemed overwhelming.
Yeah. And that's what we're looking for, right? We're looking for that control because control was taken away from us when these
Exactly.
things
I mean,
happen to us.
right. The loss of control is a necessary component of trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
So
Yep.
yeah, sometimes in trying to get that control back, you end up doing things that are harmful to yourself.
Hmm. Yep. But I think it's, you know, I think I've learned to look back on those sort of harmful coping mechanisms and understand that they were the very best that I could do at that time,
Right, of course.
you know?
Mm-hmm. Yep. You do the best you can with what you know until you learn new things
Right.
and you start doing different type of work.
Like what Maya Angelou says, when we know better, we do better. You know?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's why I think people should not be hard on themselves if they're doing things that might be harmful, because they're doing the best they can with what they know.
Exactly.
I think
Absolutely.
it's about just trying to give them additional information and guidance and resources to help them be able um, to do things that are going to be less harmful and more constructive for them.
Right. And those coping mechanisms are almost always a function of trying to deal with trauma on your own.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, we're not meant to go through those things alone.
Yeah.
We're not
No,
wired for it.
I don't think we're meant to go through anything alone,
No, I
right?
couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more.
But then, of course, sometimes because you've been hurt by other people, it's hard to turn to other people for support.
Oh, sure. Yeah, if your fundamental faith in people is shaken or shattered, the notion of turning to people for help
It's
does not seem advisable.
the last thing you want to do.
Exactly. And I was very much I'll figure it out, you
Mm-hmm.
know. My sort of self-sufficiency and independence in many ways helped me survive my childhood.
Mm-hmm.
It worked really well for me for a very long time, right up until it didn't.
Yep.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
the sort of the very thing that helped me survive all manner of trauma in childhood, which was that, like, self-reliance and I can handle this, and I also kept me from being able to ask for help when my alcoholism was spiraling, and I was starving to death when I was, going through my divorce. Those were times when I desperately needed help and I did not have the skill set to ask for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's one thing I've heard that's always kind of stuck with me, and that is, what's got you here won't get you there.
Mm.
You
Mhm.
know. So so Laura, tell me like about the things that you were trying to do for yourself before you reached out for other support.
Right. Well, at different periods of my life, I've done therapy, certainly. Not as a child. I had a couple of sessions as a child in the immediate aftermath that did more harm than good. Um, but in adulthood, I did. But I would say for me that the biggest part of my healing has come from reclaiming my story and telling it on my own terms.
Mm. When did you start doing that? When did you start speaking out about it?
So I started blogging in 2014, and I had no intention of writing about any of this. I didn't know what I was going to write about, but it was absolutely not going to be this. Um, And I went to a conference in Chicago called Storyline Conference. And the man who was running it, Donald Miller, kept saying, "What will the world miss if you don't tell your story?"
Mm.
And I couldn't shake it. It kept it felt like it was following me around, nipping at my heels. And then 2 weeks later, I got a friend request from my cousin Mary, who I had not seen in 35 years. She was from my father's side of the family, and I think I saw her one time after I disclosed at my grandmother's funeral. And I accepted her friend request, and we reconnected. And I found out that she had been abused too. And so I went up in January of 2015 to reconnect with her in person. And on a whim, we walked into a police station and reported our grandfather. He'd been dead for a long time, but it just sort of felt like I wonder what would happen if we, you
Mm-hmm.
know. Um, and they took it really seriously, even though he was dead and there was not going to be, any prosecution or anything like that. They took a formal report. They investigated. They actually found another victim outside the family the next day. Um,
Oh, well, that's great. They took it seriously.
they did. And that is sadly not everyone's experience, but that was
Right.
our experience. Um, and so because I had begun blogging, it sort of seemed like the natural thing to tell this story. And so
Mm-hmm.
I wrote about it and the post went viral. And so I went from, having not talked about my abuse, only told a handful of people for the majority of my life, to being inundated with people sending me their stories and saying me too. And um
Oh, and what was
that
that like for you when that happened?
that was overwhelming
Uh-huh.
because first of all, I was still an active alcoholic and not healthy.
Mm-hmm.
And so I felt like I needed to respond to every email and comment in real time and help everybody. And, boundaries were very much a foreign language for me at that point. Um, and so it was a really overwhelming experience, and probably sent me hurtling toward rock bottom, for which I'm eternally grateful. So I wouldn't change anything about that. But the overwhelmingly positive thing that came out of it was that I stopped feeling alone in what had happened to me.
Mm.
The sheer volume of response was overwhelming. And the nature of sexual abuse is drenched in so much shame and secrecy. And so even though obviously I knew I wasn't the only person this had happened to, it very much felt like I was.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you're receiving thousands of emails and comments, and many from people whose story I would have said I knew, people in my life whose story I was sure I knew, saying me too.
Mm.
It really just complete, and the fact that my story was met with such empathy. Brene Brown says shame can't survive empathy, and that has very much been my experience. Um, I had over, it not solely positive because it is the internet,
Mm-hmm.
but but mostly positive. Um, and I got this amazing feeling of connectedness with all these other people who had been through something similar to me and had felt the same way I'd felt, and it had played out the same way in their lives. And I was having those conversations with Mary, my cousin, whose, the abuse had played out. I mean, there were so many parallels in our lives. It was ridiculous. And so all those things that I'd really not connected to my abuse, I had I had looked at them as moral failures, or just character flaws or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when you're seeing that as a common thread through thousands of stories, you start to say, wait a minute,
You start to connect the dots.
start to connect the dots. And so that experience really dissipated the shame around my abuse. And the
Mm.
shame is what kept me sick.
Mm.
The shame and keeping those secrets is what kept me sick all those years. And so,
And how many people knew about what had happened to you up until this point?
um, how many people, I can't say how many people knew because I don't know in terms of like parents telling people how many people I had told. I'd for sure told less than 10 people in my entire life.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I will say that until I told the officer who took our statement, Officer Paul, I had never told another human being what had happened to me without having to stop and console them.
Oh, wow.
And so I think that very much contributed to my belief that my story was unspeakable.
Mm-hmm.
That I couldn't burden other people with it, that it was really terrible, um, and so part of what was so healing about telling him was he had no emotional skin in the game.
Right.
He just was finding facts. And so being led through our story by someone who was compassionate but not involved changed the way I saw my story.
Mm-hmm.
It changed the way I understood my story. And so that's a lot of what we do through Say It Survivor. We have writing workshops for survivors of sexual abuse, and we lead the participants through their stories to help them reframe them and to help them write a new ending. Because when you don't have, sometimes the stories that you tell yourself about what happened to you can't survive being told. Sometimes just the act of saying something out loud is enough of a challenge to the veracity of it.
Mm-hmm.
Like there were things that I said about what I should have done in the situation where Officer Paul just looked at me and said, "No, no, you were 8. You actually didn't have a job in
Mm-hmm.
that, you
Mm-hmm.
know? But that had never occurred to me.
Yeah, and of course,
Had
and
never
no
occurred.
one had said that to you before then.
Right. And it had never occurred to me that I wasn't complicit. It had never occurred to me that I didn't have a responsibility for how it played out afterward. That those were stories that even if I had said them aloud to someone, someone else in my life, they probably would have said, "Well, I don't know about that." Um, but I hadn't because I wasn't telling my story,
Mm-hmm.
and so we tried, we it very quickly became clear to us that this was bigger than our story. This reaction was not because our story is extraordinary, because it's not. The numbers don't support our story being extraordinary. Um, but we knew we couldn't offer what happened to us in this experience to anyone else because it was lightning in a bottle. I mean, having a post go viral and getting that particular officer, and it's not recreatable, but
Yeah.
what we could do was distill what it was that was so healing about it and then offer that.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a lot of what we do. Um,
It sounds like that's like where a lot of your healing really started to
ab-
take place.
absolutely,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely.
Yeah.
The experience around that, telling my story publicly and having that reaction. And then honestly, my work with Say It Survivor, every time I'm working with another survivor and helping her process her story, I'm processing mine. And
Mm-hmm.
every time I remind her that she doesn't need to be ashamed, I'm reminded that I don't need to be ashamed. I mean, this is how it works, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah. And I love how, you told your story to, like you said, someone who had no emotional skin in the game, and they believed you, and it, it was something that they took seriously, and it affected them, and that changed everything for you, because why would this person, have a reason to be reacting any differently, right? So I love how that was the case for you, and I
yeah,
can see how powerful that could be.
yeah, I mean, it was a really, it pains me that to know how many survivors who go in to try and do something similar have a different experience.
Right.
You know, we were really, really fortunate in the officer that we dealt with, and his commanding officer, and how he was trained and what their priorities were. I mean, we were incredibly fortunate in our particular circumstance, but there is, there's that saying, people begin to heal the moment they feel heard.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the first time I can honestly say, in telling my story, where I just felt completely heard. And I didn't feel like I had to comfort him, and I didn't feel ashamed telling him. It was just like, here's what happened. And he wrote it down. And that's the name of the post. He wrote it down.
Mm. Well, maybe we can have that linked up on the show notes page.
Yeah, that would
If
be
that's still
great.
up on if that's still
Yeah.
available.
Yep. I just launched a new website, but I had all that content transferred over, so I can send you the link to that. Yep.
Great, yeah. I'll definitely get that linked up if anyone wants to check it out. Um, so Laura, I mean, how are you doing today? Are there things that, you're still struggling with?
Well, I'm doing great. As I said, I'm sober, which is one of the great gifts of my life. I'm in recovery from my disordered eating. I'm happy. I'm healthy. And in many ways, I feel like my experience, my trauma has been redeemed by the work that I've done. One of the things that Mary and I always say is that we put work boots on our pain. We give it a job, right? So this terrible thing happened, but now we're in a position to help other people with it. And so that has been enormously healing for me. But I do still have triggers from time to time. I do still have, it's usually sensory things, sights or smells or things like that, that I can have a flashback on. They're much less than they used to be. Sleep used to be a real huge issue for me, and it's not anymore. So that's great. And I also, having done the work, I have practices now. I can sense when I'm triggered, and I know the things to do to kind of ground myself in my body. And I practice. It's the craziest thing, but I practice self-care now. So
it's not it's not an easy thing to do, right?
it's
But
not
it's
an
so
easy thing to
important.
do. Yeah, it's not an easy thing to do, and it's not a selfish thing to do. It's an important thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm better able to, for instance, most mornings when I wake up, in my inbox, someone will have sent me their story. I get stories almost every day.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the sort of signs to me that I have really healed and grown and changed is that I check in with myself, and if I'm not in a place to take in the story, I don't read it.
Mm-hmm.
I read it later when I am, but I practice self-care in, like, is this good for me? If this isn't good for me, I don't do it.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
Which wouldn't have occurred to me. Honestly, it just wouldn't have occurred to me before I got sober and before I got well. I would have felt the need to do it right then and there, regardless of the toll it would take.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't do that anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, it can be a difficult thing to set that boundary, but so important to do,
Hmm.
and so necessary sometimes.
Yeah, and I think trauma survivors, and particularly sexual trauma survivors, have a real hard time with boundaries. You know,
Yeah,
you
absolutely.
you've had your boundaries crossed in a really extreme way. And so, one of the things that I always say is, when I said no, what I learned from that was that my no was not enforceable,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, I could say no, but things would get worse.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a really powerful lesson for a little girl to learn.
Yeah.
And so growing up, I just didn't have any boundaries at all. Which, meant that I was exhausted and that I exhausted people. I was exhausted and exhausting,
Mm-hmm.
um, because I just didn't understand them. They were a foreign language to me.
What helped you to start setting boundaries?
Um, Getting sober certainly was the biggest thing. And understanding, having that experience when he wrote it down went viral, and going through that experience with absolutely no boundaries whatsoever, and seeing the effect that it had on me, in retrospect, once I got sober, um, that I cannot give away what I don't have. And
Mm-hmm.
so if I don't have boundaries, and if I don't defend those boundaries, I am not in a position to be of service to anyone.
Mm-hmm.
And so truly, if my calling and passion is to help people through this work, and it is, then I can only do that if I have rock solid boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so I really do now. In fact, I had someone the other day say, "You have good boundaries." And I was like, "I know, right? Can you believe
That's a
it?"
nice that's a nice compliment.
I know. I was very excited.
um, so yeah, tell us more about what it is that you do today. I know we've talked about it a little bit. And with Say It Survivor, you're doing that with your cousin Mary, right?
Yes. Yep. So we have two primary missions with Say It Survivor. The first is to help survivors of child sexual abuse reclaim their stories as part of a path to healing. So we bring survivors into community with each other in a workshop setting, and Mary and I tell our story, and then we have a series of writing prompts that we sort of are designed to lead survivors through their story in a methodical way and help them what we call it untangling the narrative, right? Like what's fact, what's story. Because at the end of the day, when you're dealing with healing from trauma, you're not the your work doesn't lie in the facts of what happened because there's nothing you can do about them. They happened. Your
Mm-hmm.
work lies in the story, right? So what did you tell yourself about it? What were you told about it? And how did that change the way you saw yourself and the world?
Mm-hmm. It's about the beliefs and beginning to reframe them, right?
Absolutely. And the thing is, the thing about story is it can be rewritten. Facts can't, you know? So
Mm-hmm.
so you have to accept the fact of what happened, but first you have to decide what are the facts and what is the story around it. And I can tell you that in all the workshops we've done, I've I've yet to find a woman who didn't realize that all of her work lay in the story.
And so you do these workshops in person?
Yep. Yep. We don't generally do them in the winter as much because we've had to cancel. We're in New England. We've had to cancel for weather too many times. So our next one that we have scheduled is in Burlington, Vermont in May, but we'll have some more on the books in spring too. We have a couple that we're still trying to get confirmed. And then we also do parent talks where we talk to parent groups about sexual abuse in general and you know, sort of information around it, but primarily about their reaction should their child disclose, about the power of their reaction, about the influence of their reaction, and sort of try to teach them constructive ways to process that information and to help their kids.
Mm-hmm. And now, if someone's interested in checking out one of these workshops, where could they go to get more information?
They can go to sayitsurvivor.org, and that has links to our to events, that has links to we have a blog where survivors have a forum to tell their stories anonymously. We have a survivor gallery where survivors submit a photo of themselves at the age of their abuse, and so it's a wall of photos of us. And we have a really thriving online community, which is just a really nice place to get support and to feel less alone. So we have a Facebook page, the Say It Survivor Facebook page, and yeah. So and our email, if you go on to the page where Mary and I are on in our bio, um, we have both have emails there that we can be contacted at.
Great. Yeah, I'll have all that linked up on your show notes page. So, how has it been getting to do this work with your cousin?
Oh, it's been amazing. Mary and I were incredibly close when we were little, and so to have her kind of torn from me that way was, trauma upon trauma.
Mm,
Um, and it's been great. We've been reunited now for, gosh, 3 years, and I talk to her every day,
mm-hmm.
and it's great because she's a part of my story, so she understands aspects of my story that nobody else does.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's just been a joy and a blessing, and it's amazing. It's an absolute gift.
Mm, that's so great that you both get to reconnect.
Yeah. Yep.
Um, and now you also have like your own website, right? It's In Others' Words.
That was the old website.
Oh, okay.
I actually just launched the new website this past week, and it's just my name, lauraparrottperry.com.
Okay, gotcha.
And all of the content from In Others' Words is there. So everything is merged over.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the best place to go to find things is lauraparrottperry.com, all one word.
Okay. I'll have that linked up as well. And
Great.
yeah, and I know the time that this is going live, your book will have come out. Do you want to tell us anything about that?
Yeah. So the book is called She Wrote It Down: How a Secret Keeper Became a Storyteller. And so it's a collection of essays sort of about the secrets that I spent most of my life keeping and how I transformed through starting to tell my stories publicly, how I transformed into a storyteller, and how really that transformation is what healed me.
Nice. And where can people find that?
That will be on Amazon and Amazon Kindle on January 23rd.
Sounds good. Yeah, so I think I would like to ask you the final question that I have for you today, Laura. And that is, given what you know now, if you could go back to when you were going through your tough times and give yourself one piece of advice, what would it be?
That's a great question. Um, Well, I think I spent so much of my life being really afraid to do the work. I was really afraid to delve into it, and I thought that I could sort of hustle my way out of it or ignore it or whatever. And I think if I had to go back and talk to a younger version of me, I would tell her that her story's not unspeakable and that she'll be okay. I it will take time and it will take work, but the one thing that I tell my clients who are hesitant to do the work or talk about their abuse is this: the work is not going to be worse than the wound, and you already survived that. We get so terrified to, whether it's because we've been told not to speak or society has attached so much shame to what happened to us, but it builds up this feeling that we can't survive talking about it. And the fact of the matter is if you survive the thing, you sure as heck can survive talking about it. It already happened. You already got through that part. That is the worst of it. And now it's just leaning in and doing the work. And that's the way to freedom. That's the way to stop having what I call, unreliable narrators, having someone else tell your story for the rest of your life. That you can survive doing the work. You absolutely can.
Mm-hmm. I love that message. Yeah. I mean, so many people feel that way that, that they can't survive doing the work or it seems scary or daunting. But that is the path to freedom. And I love how you say, like, we don't have to keep letting other people tell the story of our lives. We get to choose what that's going to look like going forward.
Right. Well, I say it all the time to the women I work with. You either own your story or it owns you.
Mm-hmm.
Period. Those
Mm-hmm.
are really the only two options.
Yeah,
And
that's it.
and when you are not telling your story, it will find a way to tell itself. So my story was told in alcoholism and anorexia and perfectionism and sleeplessness and fear and control, and all of those things were my story being told. I just wasn't the one telling it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if we have that choice, then why not be the one that gets to tell it?
Absolutely. Take back the narrative.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, Laura, I think we have all of the links we've already mentioned that we'll have on the show notes page. I mean, are there any others that I should include on there that we haven't mentioned yet? Ways people can connect or find out about everything you have going on?
No, I think sayitsurvivor.org and lauraparrottperry.com will both have links to anything else that's going on, and those are both great ways to reach me. I'm reachable both places.
Okay, sounds good.
And if anyone is in need of resources, I'm happy to point them in the right direction. So just shoot me an email and I will point you in the right direction to help.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. So just want to thank you, Laura, for coming on here today, for sharing your story. And I think, you have such an important message, and hopefully, it's been helpful to those listening, and someone's been able to take something away from it that, they're going to be able to use in their own lives and take back their narrative. So thank you for sharing with us today.
Thank you so much, Melissa. I really appreciate you asking.
All right. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, you too.
Thanks for listening to the show today. This has been the Grass Gets Greener podcast, episode 125. Go to thegrassgetsgreener.com/Laura Perry to find the links mentioned during this episode or to leave a comment. So I hope you enjoyed this episode with Laura. I love the idea of reclaiming our stories and taking back our narratives. As she said, we either own our stories or they own us. And the choice is up to us, which is the good part. So I hope you've been inspired to reclaim your story today. And I'm excited to announce that the next episode will be with Mary Lovely, Laura's cousin mentioned in this episode, who she runs Say It Survivor with. So you'll get to hear from Mary about her experience and what's helped her in her healing. So if you like this episode, then definitely be sure to come back for that one in 2 weeks. Also head over to the website to grab your free copy of the Top 10 Strategies Guide for Survivors. In it, you'll find the top 10 most common strategies my podcast guests have used for overcoming the effects of past trauma. It's a great place to get started if you're looking for some strategies that can help you in your healing, as they have helped my guests. And you can find that at thegrassgetsgreener.com/guide, or also on the show notes page. So be sure to grab that if you haven't yet. And lastly, don't forget to head over to iTunes or Stitcher to leave the show a rating and review so that we can reach as many survivors as possible. And, as always, have hope.